But okay, I think for now we will start, and then if people are late, then that's fine because we will. It's going to be recorded anyway. So first and foremost, thank you so much for coming to this event. This is an event organised by the Connected Sociologies Project, which is funded by the Sociological Review Foundation and aims to make open access resources available to teachers, students, and anybody else that may be interested for the rethinking of sociological concepts and categories. This event, what is the colonial global economy rather, serves as a launch of sorts for our module on colonial global economy, which features some brilliant lectures and resources covering British slave ownership and its legacies, racial capitalism, unfree labour, and much more. So today's event will focus on examining the importance of historical colonial relations to the establishment and continued reproduction of processes of global political economy, including colonially instituted arrangements, bit of a mouthful, and relationships which persist into the present. So I'll just introduce our speakers in the order on which they will appear on your screens in front of you. So first and foremost, we're going to have Paul Gilbert, who is a senior lecturer in international development at the University of Sussex. His research and teaching is focused on the extractive industries, colonial legacies in finance, and the study of finance, and for-profit contractors in aid and development. He's also currently co-editing an image-driven volume that addresses the entanglements of finance, race, and empire. He'll be followed by Dr. Perla Polanco-Leal, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Sheffield, where she works with Genevieve Le Baron on the research project Restructuring Business Models and Supply Chains to promote fair, equitable labour standards and worker rights in the face of a pandemic, a collaborative research project between the University of Sheffield, Yale University, and Stanford, funded by Humanity United. We then have Genevieve Le Baron, who's a professor of politics at the University of Sheffield, whose research focuses on unfree labour in the global capitalist economy, with recent work on labour in global tea and cocoa supply chains. She is also the co-chair of Yale University's Modern Slavery Working Group. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Keston Perry, who is a lecturer in economics in the University of on the West of England and political economist with expertise in climate policy and justice, international political economy, development policy, resource-based industrialization, and economic development issues in the global south. Each speaker will speak for approximately 10 minutes and then we'll open up to a Q&A. If you have general comments, feel free to just put them in the chat. But I think there should be a Q&A box as well that you can use to ask questions that we'll then sort of get to at the end. So I'm going to hand over to Paul now, who's going to sort of open us up and get us started. If you're ready, Paul.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Amit, and thanks everyone. Thank you, Gaminda, for putting this together. So I'm going to try and talk in sort of general terms about this idea of the colonial global economy that was discussed in the introductory lecture to the Connected Sociologies curriculum, but focus it around a different particular example to try and draw out some features of what we might call the colonial global economy today. So I think one of the central things that I would want to draw attention to when speaking about colonial global economy is that there was no post-colonial rupture in the global economy. There wasn't a sudden break. Institutions, political economic structures, and the imaginaries that animate investment in the global south exhibit a remarkable degree of continuity with the colonial period. And there's also, increasing research, some from Gaminda, in her Discover Society piece, that you can see on precisely how public wealth as well as private wealth in the global north has been shaped by extraction from the colonies. One of the most widely discussed examples in recent years has been Utsa Patnaik's rediscovery or re-promotion of work on the drain of wealth from India, where through the home charges incurred on India's budget, resources are transferred to London, and Indian exporters were essentially then paid out of their own taxes. Other recently published work has looked at how colonial currency reserves in the post-World War II period were forcibly invested in British national and municipal securities, essentially bolstering the establishment of the welfare state while imposing austerity type policies on the colonies. And the work from the UCL's Legacy of Slave Ownership project, Nicholas Draper and others have shown that even the railways in the UK have been funded to a large degree by slave wealth. I think upwards of 10% of the Glasgow Railway in 1837 was from subscriptions from slave-derived wealth. And those resource, not exactly transfers, but forms of extraction, looting, redistribution under colonialism have shaped patterns of wealth accumulation, patterns of wealth inequality today. But a lot of the structures that we saw during the colonial period persist or have returned in other guises. And this is why you get fantastic work coming out from Third World Network Africa, focusing on how, although a lot of the struggles for resource sovereignty, the desire to challenge the structural dependencies created by raw material export reliance in a lot of African economies in the immediate post-colonial period, a lot of the efforts to restructure the international economic order, restructure international investment law, was sort of thwarted through the 70s and 80s. And then since the 80s, multilateral development institutions have been encouraging even more raw material export-led pathways to development. And I think what has happened is there's a continuity of these kinds of extractive policies, exploitative policies, structures that were seen during the colonial period. But today, the language around them appears technical, so disguises the colonial continuities. Jemima Pierre, an anthropologist based in the US, uses the idea of a racial vernacular of development to talk about how the language of good governance, or the threat of resource nationalism in formerly colonized resource-dependent nations is treated as this kind of technical governance failure issue. But she describes this language as a racial vernacular because it sustains racial thought, it sustains ideas about the inherent inferiority of formerly colonized peoples, and disguises the continued enactment of the same kind of extractive and exploitative structures which shaped economies in the colonial period. And just briefly, because I know I don't have too much time, one example that I think is worth narrating to highlight the many dimensions of colonial global economy and how colonial era economic practices, imaginaries, and so on persist, is to look again at the Maracana massacre from August 2012. So many of you are probably familiar with this, the striking mine workers at the Lonmin mine in Maracana in South Africa, Lonmin being a London-listed company at the time, and 34 striking mine workers were killed by the South African police. The current president, Ramaphosa, was at the time on Lonmin's board, discussed with other Lonmin directors the workers as plainly, dastardly criminal. And the center of the strike was that rock drillers demanded a 12,500 Rand basic wage. And in the research that followed, in the inquiries that followed the massacre, economists like Dick Forsland have shown that using essentially tax avoidance structures through a Lonmin subsidiary based in Bermuda, Lonmin moved 1.7 billion Rand out of South Africa between 2009 and 2012. And Forsland calls this not only tax evasion, but wage evasion, right? Because that is wealth that not only was deprived from the public coffers, but could have covered the rock drillers' wage demands. And a lot of political economists and economic geographers call the network of financial secrecy jurisdictions or offshore territories Britain's second empire. These networks of territories centered on the City of London that facilitate tax liability minimization and secrecy are in many cases kind of remnants of the British Empire, overseas territories and crown dependencies. But the Maracana, Bermuda, London wealth extraction connection is not something that is should just be understood as enabled by, past colonial geographies, or this sort of path dependency from a former colonial period. But it's a product of real continuities in unequal transfer of wealth, and has its roots, as recent work by Vanessa Ogle has shown, a lot of the financial secrecy and tax minimization arrangements using overseas territories and crown dependencies were actively promoted as solutions for white settlers in southern and eastern Africa who wanted to avoid being subjected to income taxes towards the end of empire. And that included many South African mine owning and mine investing families. And so the kind of violence exercised on Black mine workers from a London-based company who avoided paying wages and taxes through Britain's Second Empire is not novel, right? It is what Maria Divica-Stava in her research on Americana argues is a kind of repetition or return of these patterns of financing anti-Black extractive industries in South Africa since the 19th century. But a lot of this continuity is then disguised by kind of technical language of risk, right? So after Americana, as Patrick Bond has shown, Moody's, the credit rating agency, threatened a downgrade of major mining companies in case they increased their wage bills to stave off other protests, and a downgrade of South Africa's credit rating because of the threat of nationalization in response to potential demands from strikers and others. And this history of downgrading South Africa's credit rating or shorting the rand is, as Kubla and Lipuma have shown, something that has happened repeatedly in recent history, basically based on anxieties around Black economic sovereignty, Black rule in South Africa, that doesn't seem to be justified by so-called economic fundamentals, right? So the kind of imaginaries which present and the racial vernacular around resource nationalism, around bad governance, which justify credit rating downgrades, disguise the kind of continuity of thought from the colonial period and the extent to which many formerly colonized territories face the same kind of extractive colonial economic structures, which many sought to overturn in the immediate post-colonial period, and which once again present a kind of a similar problem to economic sovereignty and challenging this racialized form of inequality, particularly focused on extractive industries. So that is my time, if not a little bit more. So I should probably hand over to Omid or whoever's next.
That was excellent, Paul. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, Perla, I'll just hand over to you whenever you're ready.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Ahmed. So I'm going to share my screen. First, I want to thank Gurminder and Ahmed for the invitation. I'm very happy to share my research with you and to be part of this research of this panel. In this talk, I will draw from my doctoral research where I explored the extractive industries in Mexico and Latin America. And I will build upon the early research on our current AHRC-funded project on modern slavery in the global garment supply chains that is led by Professor Lebaron. In this presentation, I will explore how the ideational aspects of colonialism continue to shape the current economic structures. I will touch upon the formation of shared identities through the adoption of Eurocentric value systems, as well as the impact of cultural abuse and the never-ending quest to fit into the social and economic norms established during colonial times. I will argue that the practices such as extractivisms, which aim to fund social programs, are attempts to use redistributive justice to heal the damage of colonialism. However, these practices often overlook the importance of restorative justice, where injustice of recognition needs to be addressed. Lastly, I will talk about how the fragmented production networks perpetuate power dynamics that maintain the status quo of the economic system. My approach to this talk comes from a constructivist perspective, where one of the main premises is the mutual constitution of agents and structures. The actions of individuals produce and reproduce norms. Simultaneously, norms produce, constrain, or enable the individual's actions. People basically learn, recognize, and reproduce norms and power dynamics, which over time become normalized and part of the shared identity. Analyzing the discursive practices in the historical context can uncover the processes by which certain ideas are perpetuated throughout time. Their Eurocentric ideas established in colonial territories introduces values and harmful social patterns that were perpetuated by post-colonial regimes through social learning and communication. Colonialism essentially establishes the mechanisms by which post-colonial states are bounded to. In the case of Latin America, regions were valued according to the commodities they could provide. The extraction of natural resources from colonial territories was the main source of income of the Spanish Empire. However, the extractive industries also became a symbol of rights and representation. In the early 800s, people started to demand greater equality and representation. As revolts and fights became more common in the Nueva España, the debates for representation and equality in the Americas quickly raised in the courts of Cadiz. Rights of citizenship and representation in the Spanish Congress were discussed in the courts of Cadiz. Advocates for equal rights challenged the caste system and argued in favor of equal representation. These debates reveal a link with the extraction of natural resources and the provision of rights. In this example, we can see how the speech links mining with representation. We can see where it says those cities were founded by the hands of those being excluded. Castes who decorated the temples with precious metals, castes who extract the metals from the mines, metals which are the blood of the states. The next example brings a more unfortunate perspective of the times. The Consulate of Mexico sent a memorial to the Congress asking for an increased representation of deputies for Spaniards living in the Nueva España. However, the memorial argued against the representation of the castes and the indigenous people. The language from the consuls showed that the attitudes towards caste and indigenous people in the Americas who are referred as Indios. In this example, the memorial dehumanizes the individual and equals economic values with dignity. The negative connotation of the indigenous people works under the premise that the lack of property ownership, clothing, and shelter is the same as lack of compassion, feelings, or attachment to life. The prevalence of these harmful sets of values can be seen in the repetition of these ideas throughout time. The following example shows how the negative representation of indigenous people by foreign companies remains in the collective memory. During a debate on energy policy in 2008, a Mexican legislator recalled the oil nationalization and statements of the owner of Shell, where he said that the filthy Indios will be asking help of the technicians from the company, and he also recalled that the Mexicans had the skills and ability to run the company. In these examples, we can observe the impact of cultural abuse throughout the years. The main negative effect of injustice of recognition is the lasting impairment to develop a positive sense of shared identity. Many Latin American countries have nationalized their industries with the aim to heal the damage caused in colonial times through redistributive practices. However, restorative justice is often overlooked, as well with the need to prioritize social well-being over the interest of corporations. Having explored how the recentic values established during colonial times prevail in broad economic processes, I'm going to move the focus towards the global supply chains. While globalization and current forms of multinational corporations seems like new developments in the economy, the underlying power dynamics and the infrastructure of supply chains is very old and has remained in place for a long time. Genevieve will talk about this aspect in more depth. The global production networks are highly fragmented. A main issue in this area are the gaps on regulatory frameworks, which has created an environment where stakeholders, such as manufacturers or producers, need to compete with each other, often at the expense of labor standards and broader social and environmental well-being. The labor conditions at the bottom of the supply chains have remained the same for a long time. The lack of consistent regulation across the globe enables broader patterns of exploitation where resources are taken from the global south for the benefit of the global north. The gaps on labor governance system leave the regulations in supply chains in the hands of corporations. CSR, or corporate social responsibility, has gained great popularity. However, the lack of specific definition hinders a systematic analysis of its impacts. Programs such as ethical certification schemes can be costly and often seen as part of PR practices. Corporations have the decision-making capabilities over which providers to choose the labor standards they uphold and their own level of accountability. Without a consistent regulatory framework, the interests of corporations are very likely to be at the heart of CSR programs. Those interests will likely aim to maintain the status quo of the economic system. The recentive sector values established during colonial times remain at the heart of the global economy, where the production and provision of resources and commodities are perceived as the main source of value for nations in the global south. This set of ideas portrays workers in the global south as instruments of labor rather than stakeholders. This practices dehumanize individuals by silencing their voices and obscuring their wants and needs. The gap in governance regulatory frameworks constrains the development of the global south by prioritizing interests of corporations above social well-being. I hope you have enjoyed the talk, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you very much for that, Perla. That was really brilliant. And so Genevieve, I'll just pass over to you now, because I think what you're going to say is going to kind of dovetail with Perla's presentation.
Thank you so much. Do you see my slides, Amit? Has that worked?
Yep, that's worked.
That's worked. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much to Gurminder and to Emmett for the kind invitation and for organizing this session. I think the Connected Sociologies Curriculum project is extremely important, and I'm incredibly honored to be part of it with the brilliant colleagues also on this panel. I've been asked to focus today on unfree labor in global supply chains. And I want to talk about how unfree labor relations today both reflect and re-ingrain wealth inequalities and modes of value extraction that have been anchored and forged in historical colonial relationships. I think this picks up really nicely from where my colleague Perla just left off and reinforces a lot of what Paul said at the beginning about the lack of rupture in dynamics of wealth extraction over multiple centuries of capitalist development. I'll start by briefly arguing that the dominant approaches to understanding unfree labor in the global economy tend to gloss over these historic and ongoing dynamics of colonial capitalism and predictably giving rise to unfree labor in global supply chains. And then I'll just briefly illustrate this through an example of the tea supply chain. So to start with the dominant approaches, unfree labor today is a widespread phenomenon in the capitalist economy. As a growing body of interdisciplinary research across the social sciences shows, it's common in many different supply chains, from care work to coffee, from tea to garments, from domestic labor to sugar. And in many cases, the patterns of unfree labor, as well as the actual infrastructures and power dynamics within these supply chains, trace back to and reinforce colonial relations. There are two key dominant literatures that have looked at unfree labor in the economy, but I'll argue that both of them tend to overlook these colonial dynamics. So I want to say just a couple of things about each of them for the sake of time. The first is the Marxist literature on capitalism and unfree labor, much of which echoes a long-standing contention in political economic theory popularized by 18th century thinker Adam Smith, that capitalism and unfree labor are fundamentally incompatible. Smith contended that not only do firms have a preference for free-wage workers, who he saw as more economically efficient than slave labor, but he also thought that slavery stunted capitalist development, growth, and productivity. And multiple veins of contemporary Marxist thinking continue to see and argue unfree labor, that they see it as fundamentally incompatible with capitalism, rather than the blood and terror that actually characterizes its core of development. Gurminder Bhamra has a brilliant recent article about this in Review of International Political Economy journal. And with my colleagues Seb and Peter, I've also written a recent review of Marxist debates about capitalism and unfree labor, which I put on the slide in case anyone's interested in that side of things. The second dominant approach to understanding unfree labor is a liberal, human rights-oriented modern slavery literature. I've displayed some recent key books from this literature here on this slide, and I'm sure it's clear just from the cover of these books that there's really a lot to say about this literature in the context of thinking about colonial global economy. For the sake of time here, I'll just say that the arguments put forward about capitalism in the literature also tend to gloss over the importance of colonial history and ongoing dynamics. These thinkers see causality for unfree labor as lying primarily in cultural and moral factors. And where the economy comes into it at all, usually we get some kind of vague analysis of globalization, a kind of neo-Malthusian anxiety about unchecked population growth, scarce resources, or poverty. But unfree labor in this paradigm is really about individual criminality, cultural backwardness, corruption, and poverty. Brilliant scholars like Elena Shee, Janie Chuang, Adele Blackett, Kamala Kempadu, Julia O'Connell-Davidson, Nandita Sharma, and others have heavily criticized the modern slavery framing of this problem. They've argued, for instance, that this approach to understanding unfree labor distorts the political economic nature of the problem, its causes and effective solutions, that it gives cover to anti-immigrant, anti-sex, white saviorism, and misogynist politics, and that it masks and naturalizes the racial, gendered, and economically unequal fabric of the global economy. I want to take just a moment to emphasize how important this last point is. I think one of the most dangerous assertions that's made within this literature, which is not only a scholarly literature, but hugely influential in policy terms, is that within the old slavery, race was important in shaping who is subjected to enslavement. But today, they see an equal opportunity slavery, as they call it, wherein anyone of any race or gender has an equal chance of being subjected to unfree labor. And of course, we know that that isn't true. Research clearly shows that women workers, migrant workers, workers who are indigenous and people of color, low-waged workers, and LGBTQI workers are disproportionately concentrated in the worst forms of exploitation and supply chains. And this isn't a coincidence, but rather it's rooted in the reality that they have been and continue to be incorporated into the capitalist economy on unequal, exploitative, oppressive, and often unfree terms. So I want to build on this important body of scholarship by arguing that both of these dominant approaches to understanding unfree labor and supply chains really gloss over the historic and ongoing dynamics of colonial capitalism in giving rise to unfree labor in the economy today. And these dynamics differ across supply chain and context, but generally they include a history of and ongoing dynamics of dispossession and expropriation, histories of unfree labor systems that continue to shape the lives of contemporary workers and communities, the historic role of wealthy states and corporations in engineering global supply chains and trade systems, which were often forged in the colonial era, and which are hardwired to produce unequal wealth and value distribution, and do so through endemic labor exploitation, violence, and coercion. So to illustrate this, I'd like to close by just briefly sharing an example of unfree labor in the global tea supply chain. Over the last few years, my research has investigated global business models of forced labor in tea and cocoa supply chains. And as part of that study, my research team and I did a survey and interviews with around 600 tea workers in 2 regions of India, in Assam and in Kerala. And we found that forced labor continues to be widespread in the tea supply chain. Every single worker in our study reported some form of labor abuse, and the worst forms of abuse that coalesce in unfree labor were widespread also within the industry. And what I want to emphasize here is that although these dynamics tend to be investigated very much as contemporary problems, as Perla said, linked to globalization, multinational corporations, the restructuring of the economy since the 2000s, actually unfree labor in the tea supply chain today cannot be understood without understanding its colonial history and ongoing dynamics. Historians like Rana Behal at the University of Delhi have done brilliant work on the early development of the tea industry in India under colonial rule. And we know that many contemporary tea companies, in fact, built the supply chains through which they continue to function through dispossession, expropriation, and unfree labor in the colonial era. So companies like the Assam Company and the British East India Company established tea plantations in Assam in the 1820s and 30s using military force to fulfill British demand for tea and British company profitability. And unfree labor was part of the global tea system from these early days. European companies secured legislation from the colonial state that allowed them to create an indentured labor system on tea plantations. And this included the right to immobilize workers, to confine them to tea plantations, as well as to use violence against them. I unfortunately don't have time to go too much into detail here, but I just want to emphasize how inseparable contemporary dynamics are from this history. And in some ways, when we look at supply chains from the point of view of the workers, very, very little has changed in this industry. So the majority of the workers that we interviewed in Assam were the direct descendants of families who had been forcibly migrated under colonial rule to the plantations. And they emphasized that their families have never managed to secure enough money, even though they've been working in the tea industry full-time, highly profitable supply chain for many generations, to leave the remote plantations. As well, they emphasize how little is actually changed in terms of the working and living conditions on the tea plantations over several generations of their family. What began as bonded labor, officially, juridically, remains a highly unfree labor system, even if now the work is considered free and is recognized to be taking place in these highly profitable multinational corporation supply chains. But the perspective from workers, differs very dramatically from how tea companies explain their colonial past. So you can see on this, there's a little screenshot from the Assam Company website where they refer to the plantations as little paradises. And this is obviously in stark contrast to the narratives that workers shared with us of how they see their experiences on those plantations. So I'll just close by emphasizing that I think we need much more and further scholarship on the colonial history and ongoing dynamics of global supply chains. There's a tendency to see supply chains and their regulatory issues, their uneven wealth distribution as very new phenomena related to the unique power that corporations hold in the contemporary global economy. But actually, I think there's a real need to look much deeper into history, especially where systems of unfree labor are concerned. And so I really look forward to speaking more with you all about that in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Genevieve. That was excellent. So last but definitely not least, we've got Keston. Keston, are you ready? Wherever you are, wherever you're zooming us with that great background.
I'm actually in London, so this is just a background. But thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Amit, and thanks, Gurminder, and the team for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts on what I think is a very relevant topic in light of events during the last summer, notably Black Lives Matter protests around the world, and in the context of what I think is hopefully happening in terms of a rethinking of social science, research that accounts for the ideas of colonialism that inherently imbibes our epistemological perspectives and the racist underpinnings of them, right? I think to broach this topic, I should start from the disciplinary boundaries in which I find myself, which which might be fictitious in the sense that the work I do is not squarely in economics, although I'm part of an economics department. But I think it offers a delineating line to organize my thoughts and the epistemic boundaries that enable us to understand not only the origins, but outcomes of the colonial global economy. I think my own ontological orientation as to whether a colonial global economy exists is both a temporal one, that is, to what extent an historical understanding can be excavated about the past and about how the past has shaped the material contours of possibilities of the present and future by people affected by that particular history, and people who continue to ignore that history or seek to bury it in some way or the other. Second, we can think about it in terms of a history of the present and the manifestations shaped by the lingering, deep-seated, hidden, visible, social, environmental, and political economic relations that exist today. Obviously, it's not a deterministic consideration, but very contingent on our interpretation and of what we can observe and acknowledge about those lingering manifestations of history for our collective present. For me, as an economist, or political economist is the characterization I prefer, you know, I think economics has narrowed and limited certain kinds of epistemic associations that an economist can make in terms of how do we understand history and colonial history in terms of the present and in terms of its ongoing manifestations and impacts on people, people of color, especially marginalized people, workers, people from the global south, women, and so on. As a Caribbean-born scholar, Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery has helped me trace the idea of modernity and to understand the colonial global economy. Williams, as you might know, theorized that the economic surplus from the plantations of the Caribbean region facilitated the financing of the Industrial Revolution, in part. It is also notable that Williams understood racism and the structures that perpetuated forms of racism that was facilitated the plantation system of agriculture and colonial extraction and exploitation. In other words, racism was not an invention of the plantation-based enslavement, but it was the other way around. Cedric Robinson has also alluded to this fact that racism predates capitalism and was so perpetuated by its modern day forms of exploitation, racial hierarchies, and subjugation in the global economy. We can trace serious exploitation to the institutions and almost and in an autonomous way how plantations were run in the Caribbean region. We can pinpoint as well the historical and spatial form and the manifestation of social differentiation, dispossession, exploitation, expropriation that resulted from the plantation system as a modern locus of economic activity, as George Beckford and Lloyd Best have pointed out. We can say, therefore, if we trace those lines of history and the current devastation, struggle, and violent and indifferent death that Black people, immigrants, people of color, frontline workers, and communities face working communities facing the current economic calamity to the plantation society. The forms of social differentiation that underpin current marginalization, violence, and death, especially in relation to the effects of climate change and the Anthropocene, can also thus be linked to the plantation and the forms of organization that underpin it. We can think about the plantation, therefore, as Catherine McKittrick, drawing upon the work of George Beckford's work in the 1970s, as one that underpinned the global economy. Today, we might consider this in the way of leaking resources through capital flight from the periphery to the center of the global economy through things like illicit flows of capital and so on. McKittrick suggests that we can think about the plantation in post-emancipation and perhaps post-independent lives as the ways in which plantation and the state regulated and normalizes violence and produces uneven outcomes, but also instigates resistance in one form or the other from those people who are subjugated. We can think, therefore, of this colonial global economy in terms of the conservative politician Richard Drax, who is now the wealthiest landowning and sitting MP for South Dorset, whose family and hereditary wealth is because of ownership of enslaved property on Barbados plantations. He only listed this property in Parliament just before the new year, 2021. Or we can think about that just 6 years ago, the fact that the Treasury, that is the Treasury, the Exchequer of the United Kingdom, paid off about £20 million, which is based on the payment to former enslavers at the time of emancipation in the 19th century, or which is about $2.4 billion today, or which was about 40% of the annual budget in 1834, I believe it was. This payment was made to heirs of former enslavers who were compensated in the 19th century for giving up their property of enslaved peoples, and this happened only in 2015. But particularly, I want to spend a little time of my remaining time considering how these thoughts about the colonial global economy are related to the Anthropocene and the climate crisis. In mainstream economics, environmental pollution, toxic waste, carbon emissions that lead to global warming, that generates climate change, are considered an externality. An externality, this term can be traced back to Alfred Marshall, who is an English economist and further developed by Anthony Pigo, which is defined as private costs imposed or benefits conferred on others that are not taken into account based on their own personal actions. So Marshall described how man at the time, in his book, Principles of Economics, and how man maintained and accumulated wealth from so-called collective resources, or what he refers to as the free gifts of nature that have been enriched by men, that could be owned privately through property ownership and accumulate wealth further on. Marshall interestingly refers to the backward races in writing in 56 years after emancipation in the Caribbean as being incapable of industry, and of England, the birthplace of modern competition, according to him, having been charitable for spending those $20 million to, quote, purchase the freedom of the slaves in the West Indies. This idea of an externality, I should point out, is the basis of a carbon tax. Today, the construct of a carbon tax, which is widely being discussed as a critical intervention and putting a price on carbon emissions, especially in the global north. Carbon emissions or carbon taxes do very little for addressing the inequities generated and the violence aggravated by climate change through colonial lineages. I should say as well that we can connect the idea of man's so-called command of nature to European Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, Newtonian physics, which all have had to part to play in ensuring that human beings and corporations in particular can control nature and exploit nature for all its supposed capitalist benefits, which supported the idea that nature can be exploited and has led us to the point of planetary overreach today. And almost 200 years of accumulation of carbon emissions that have had a devastating and violent effect on marginalized peoples, overexploited environments, and vulnerable modern-day plantocracies. The transplantation of African and indentured labor to serve plantation accumulation in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, and that fueled the Industrial Revolution was underpinned on the one hand by decimation of indigenous peoples. But more than this, on the other hand, they served plantation's primary economic objective, which fostered the economic production systems in the Caribbean. The decimation of indigenous populations was the first step towards a modernity that is characterized by the segregation of nature from society, and hence the economic production system that lives in the twilight of colonialism is one that emphasizes a monoculture economic system and which diminishes the vitality and the resilience of the environment. It further perpetuates this colonial modernity, further perpetuates a command over nature and a particular racialized and stratified social relations that live on to today. The burning and exploitation of fossil fuel energy that have led us to the current climate catastrophes we face today started over centuries ago and relate to the colonial plantation enterprise. As late as 1936, Howard Johnson at the University of the West Indies documented that Trinidad, as a British colonial territory, produced over 60% of the oil produced in the British Empire. Though its production was only about 0.92% of world production. He adds that the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, which have had vital interest in the development of scientific methods of refining, can be attributed to the refining process of Trinidad oil. Fast forward to the 21st century and up to 2009, Trinidad supplied as much as 70% of natural gas needs of the entire United States of America. Colonies were integral tools for the generation of wealth and greenhouse gas emissions that has caused climate change today. Although the generation of those emissions is often counted and is based upon its use in the empire and in metropolitan or what we can consider global north countries today. But these former colonies are now the victims of climate devastation. To be clear, emissions are based on how it is used in the global north, especially through in a very disproportionate way, where the majority of global north elites are responsible for more than 70 to 80% of carbon emissions today. It is on this basis we can begin to make the connection to the edifice of the plantation structure and the differentiated responsibility of the global north to the period of irreversible change leading to climate crisis today. If we consider the period of the Anthropocene as having started in 1610, which is often the timeline used by scientists, we can show that how colonization, conquest, and extraction of surplus have contributed to the current uneven impacts of global warming and climate change. The Anthropocene here is the period during which major ecological, social, and biological changes occurred that transformed the so-called gifts of nature, as it were, but also altered following the decimation of indigenous people, the abduction of millions of African bodies, and the institutionalization of colonial rule, it changed our relationship with nature. We can see that a small group of majority white countries that have accumulated immense and extraordinary wealth through this colonial enterprise have benefited from enslaved labor used in the service of exploitation, resource extraction, dispossession, and environmental degradation, and contributes to the uninhabitability of those territories today. All of this is premised on the modernity associated with European Enlightenment and capitalist industrialization. Disproportionate and differentiated levels of racialized vulnerability to climate change, then based on the accumulation of greenhouse gases that began since the 19th century, are all hallmarks of plantation enslavement. These conditions of marginalization, racial differentiation, violence, and even death created the peripheries which now face the most severe losses of human life, increased indebtedness and debt, disintegration of the means of livelihood, and renders entire island communities uninhabitable, as we have seen in Barbuda in 2017, in the Abaco Islands in the Bahamas in 2019, due to Hurricane Dorian, and repeatedly we've seen over the last few decades. The frequency of storms have accumulated into disasters and traceable to that idea that man can have control over nature and exploit nature for capitalist purposes. But it's also linked to the destruction of Black lives and to livelihoods that generate trauma, displacement, death, and new forms of social dependence and economic inequality, which are all products of colonialism left behind by this unequal global economic system. The means to some form of survival forged by anti-colonial rebellions and civic struggles are under threat by the perpetuation of the form of colonial extraction under the supervision of post-colonial governments, merchant elites, transnational corporations involved in mining, tourism, finance, and so on, currently in the Caribbean. We can also consider the experience of Haiti. Despite the many negative superlatives describing its economic situation, the most impoverished country in the Western Hemisphere is often one superlative, the most unequal, and now considered the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. These are not historical accidents. It is a country that remains of strategic corporate interest to American capital. Its celebration as one of the most lucrative French colonial territories was rewarded by Haitians paying reparations to its former colonizers. Economic embargoes as well as orchestrated coups have also marked the part of Haitian history. All these events have led to differentiated environmental and economic exposure that the country faces today. I want to recall one anecdote or one historical fact based on these orchestrated political coups, military occupation by the American forces that have all led or all done in the name of capital to widespread deforestation, that have led to widespread deforestation, change pattern of land use and ownership, and environmental practices that today renders the country susceptible to ferocious storms, perennial food shortages, and annual droughts. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is the father of the New Deal and the inspiration for the current global Green New Deal, was the Secretary of State of the Navy during the military occupation from 1915 to 1934. He once quipped that his rewriting of the Haitian Constitution to change land ownership in favor of American corporations and that dispossessed Haitian peasants was a good little constitution, according to him. This has had untold environmental damages damage and changes to environmental practices in Haiti, in addition to more extractive modern practices in terms of agriculture that have occurred under the Clintons during the 1990s and have continued to today by the US government. I want to end there for now, and thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Keston. So yeah, again, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and I'll try and get to them. So I'm going to start off with a question that's coming from Paul and to Genevieve in particular. And the person has just written, I work for a non-academic educational organisation and we're developing research and content relating to colonial supply chains for cocoa and other ingredients for chocolate making in the British Empire post-emancipation. Basically, have you got any pointers for them for public facing, with regard to that public facing outputs from your work that are not too academic, that you can point them in the direction of?
Yes, absolutely. I will put some links as a response to the question in the chat box. That's probably the easiest thing. But the project that I mentioned, the Global Business of Forced Labor project, if you look at globalbusinessofforcedlabor.ac.uk, you'll find the website for that. And as I mentioned, we studied tea and cocoa, and there's a public-facing report that we published just at the end of the data collection on the website that's free, as well as I think links to some media articles and kind of op-eds written about that. And I'll put a few other links in the chat box, but good luck with your work. It sounds really important.
Just to follow up very briefly, I don't work directly on cocoa and chocolate making like Genevieve, but I have written something with the wonderful Catherine Dolan, which is open access in the Journal of Business Anthropology, which is about an unnamed modern day chocolate corporation and kind of how their logics of corporate social responsibility don't quite transform things in an entirely responsible direction. They're not named, but you can figure out however you want to. But that, yeah, that's public facing and relatively plain language.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. So question for Perla. And the person asks, may I ask you to give more explanations about cultural abuse and relevant examples in your study, as well as further readings on cultural abuse? Thanks.
Fantastic, of course. So the cultural abuse that I explored in my research was basically looking at the discourses that has been written and like letters and other kind of media that we can analyze from archives. In these examples, we can see how the thinking at the time portray the individuals in a dehumanizing manner. And these ideas become perpetuated throughout time. Even after the independence had been achieved, people continue to think, to feel, to have this shared identity where there is a negative portrayal of the self. I don't have any further reading at hand, but if you want to send me an email or something, I can put something together to send as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Perla. So a question to all the speakers, but I'll start with Keston, just because you've had a bit of a break after your talk. Are there possibilities for post-colonial countries to change these predispositions? How and what would it look like? It's quite a big question, but if you're ready for it, Keston, to solve these issues.
This is to change the current form of the economy or social relations.
I think we can tackle both. And when I say we, obviously I don't mean me.
Yes, so I mean, one of my first papers was written with respect to how organized labor, had a part to play in transforming putting particular emphasis on industrialization, which was more or less prohibited during the period of colonialism, due to the fact that this was in Trinidad and Tobago, due to the fact that Britain more or less discouraged industrialization. And so labor, organized labor, anti-colonial struggles, various forms of civic struggles have all contributed to attempting to change the forms of the colonial economy. To say whether those efforts have been successful is left up to interpretation. In my view, there have been always remnants of the colonial economy in the Caribbean region, and it exists to today, even though the kinds of products and exports from those countries have slightly differed in the present context. So it is a challenge, but I think without stopping short of calling for revolution, I think there is work that says that there have been changes, especially with respect to the sort of racist colonial systems that were in place that helped to change inequality and make society more equal.
Excellent. Does anyone else want to jump in on that? So here's a question for everyone. I'm going to assume not. Keston, you've cracked it. You've solved the big question in one swoop. So another question to all the speakers, which is any quick ideas on what role communication and digitalization has in disrupting the colonial global economy? So whoever wants to start, feel free to jump in. I'll just direct that to Genevieve then.
Thank you, Amit. I'm sorry, by communication, just generally? Okay, so I will answer it from the point of view in terms of the topics that I spoke about and that I researched. I think one thing that we're seeing, it really resonated what Paul was saying in the beginning at his presentation about how even though a lot of these relations have endured over a long period of time, the kind of technocratic language that's used to justify them in the face of them being illegal now or considered, socially, it's less acceptable to call them what they are. All of that communication is, from my point of view, a big obstacle here. So what I'm thinking about are, when we look at the field of forced labor and supply chains, what we find are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports put together by expensive consultants and corporations that just litter the internet and that give a very specific view of what's happening in supply chains. And a lot of that information flow has been controlled very carefully by companies for a long time. I think one of the exciting opportunities here is that as there's been this shift, even within kind of corporate social responsibility forums and other things, that has come about because of challenges from workers who are excluded. Their perspectives have not been incorporated in these official mechanisms to regulate and address problems in supply chains. We're seeing all of these different forms of alternative communication and digital communication, including workers feeding in and sharing their stories in different ways and demanding redistribution of value and demanding the different forms of regulation that would address their unfreedom in these supply chains and the overall setup of the forms of wealth distribution and extraction that characterize them. So I think that there we see both a challenge in terms of the huge resources that companies and governments have to control the narrative around these issues and portray them in highly technical terms. And we also see some opportunity there in terms of workers sort of seizing space in official forums and in various movements to challenge those forms of communication. I hope that's useful and part of what the question asker was looking for.
I'm sure it is. Does anyone have anything to add to that? Okay, cool. I'm going to ask this then to Genevieve and to Keston, and just because I know you've both done some work with some UN bodies, and the question is, what role do you think international organizations like the UN have in addressing these structures, given the unsystematic focus that they take on business and human rights and the importance of CSR? So I'll just go to Keston first, so Genevieve can have a bit of a break.
Right, international bodies. I think Paul mentioned that international bodies have also been complicit in reproducing some of the colonial uneven inequalities that existed. And to the extent that there was an opportunity for that to have changed would have been in the 1970s during the period of the new international economic order that was led by anti-colonial struggles, that were led by movements in the global south, and some post-colonial leaders and so on at the United Nations were demanding a shift in the global order, and that there needed to be more equitable distribution of resources and wealth and so on. I think in addressing climate change, I think the international agencies have been, apart from providing scientific evidence, such as through the United Nations Framework on Climate Change and the IPCC, I don't know if they have been very helpful for changing that order in the current circumstances. In fact, they have worsened it and made countries even more vulnerable to the effects of climate change by way of the structural adjustment policies and neoliberal policies that have exposed and really fractured many of the states in the global south to really, build the institutional capacity to address the issue. My view on, for instance, the IMF is that the IMF needs to be abolished. It has not served the purpose of addressing these issues, and it's not really interested in those issues.
I would like to focus in my response on the International Labour Organization, because that's the UN agency that aligns most closely with my area of research. I think that's a really important question. I think one of the things that I've seen is that within the International Labour Organization itself, you have not a kind of homogenous view or position on these sorts of matters, but you have political struggles that are going on within these organizations because, for instance, at the ILO, it's a tripartite organization that has kind of equal governance and weight to workers, employers, and states. And so you see huge variation and kind of big political differences in the different groups' approaches and what they're prepared to sign on to in terms of the kind of agenda for dealing with forced labor in supply chains. I wouldn't write it off completely. A few years ago, at one of the governance forums of the International Labour Organization, there was an amazing effort by workers and several Global South governments to put forward a binding resolution around multinational liability for forced labor in the entire supply chain, which was fought, perhaps unsurprisingly, by companies and by some other governments. And so we see that there are really political battles going on. Every time a report comes out, every time a new convention is passed on forced labor or domestic labor, or any of the industries that touch upon the unfree labor dimensions I mentioned, we see a political struggle there where workers, employers, and states are all trying to put forward their agenda through the ILO. And sometimes we end up with tools and initiatives that are more helpful, and sometimes we end up with things that, to my mind, kind of give the impression that governance gaps are being closed when actually they're just reinforcing the status quo in supply chains.
Excellent. Paul, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, no, I think, well, maybe a tiny bit, that just sort of similar from the areas that I work in to what Genevieve was saying. You know, every now and then, well, the UN is currently trying, well, there is a movement to try and get a binding piece of legislation through the UN to hold corporations accountable for human rights abuses, because the current sort of voluntary system just does nothing. But there's also, you know, I'm not entirely confident that will solve all the problems. But there are also some kind of slight moves or openings, like Genevieve says, whether or not that's going to lead to an actual change or positive move. Some of those openings are not coming from the UN system, but from court rulings that are sort of shifting precedents, like the recent ruling against Vedanta Resources in the UK about holding them responsible for their Zambian subsidiary, and the ruling was based on the fact that in their CSR promotional materials they claim control over the good behavior of their subsidiary, which therefore means, as Lord Briggs interpreted it, that they exercise responsibility over it. And there have been a couple of other cases where there's been kind of like inching moves towards potential extraterritorial jurisdiction over corporations committing environmental and human rights abuses, but wholesale, yeah, I'm watching the kind of moves towards binding instruments with interest, but not necessarily hopeful they're going to solve everything, for so many reasons, including how they frame human rights and so on, and the fact it still has to get passed. And the last time there was an effort to have a binding sort of center controlling transnational corporations, it was lobbied against incredibly heavily and died a fairly premature death. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So Perla, I'm just going to put this question to you. It's come in. So it's kind of two questions. What is the role of the state in ending unfree labour? And then also, what does labour in the non-exploitative postmodern state look like? And what would its social implications be? Which I guess is as relevant as ever in the pandemic sort of era that we're in.
Yeah, well, definitely there needs to be more regulation in terms of what the labor standards should be. Currently, the level of competitiveness of a country will determine whether a company is going to come and pick the producers or the people that are going to manufacture certain products or commodities. This creates an unfavorable environment for the workers, and there is where the government should intervene to raise the labor standards and perhaps coordinate with other governments to have certain standards that should be upheld rather than leaving that to the interests of the corporations.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And then Keston, I've got a question for you from Trinidad. Can you speak more about the colonial geographies of post-emancipation and indentureship economies in the Caribbean? When I think about this topic, I specifically think about land ownership and its allotment of former plantation land to former indentured labourers, and the leaving of less fertile mountainous land to the former enslaved.
Yeah, tough one. So it was all part of the, I suppose, the way of differentiating labor and the way of differentiating who had access to resources and access to land. So after independence, in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a multicultural country that had both experiences of enslavement and indentureship, as well as Guyana, some former indentured laborers were able to receive land as a payment for work. Former enslaved people were, however, denied land and denied access to many of those resources. And really, it was a way to engineer the system for inequality, really, as opposed to addressing the real problem of inequality that was left as a result of colonialism, enslavement, indentureship. And what the effect that has had is that it has resulted in contemporary times to a political competition for much of those resources and resources that come from the energy sector as well. So it has really, not addressed many of those problems, apart from, what post-colonial governments tried to do was to provide employment, provide education and so on, but that has not actually reduced inequality. It has, generated a certain middle class per se, but a very vulnerable kind of middle class that really perpetuates, at the end of the day, a racial hierarchy. And people who are the poorest in society are still Black and brown. So
yeah, thank you for that, Keston. That kind of ties into another question that's come in. And the question is from someone that works in coal extraction in Colombia. And they basically asked, what do you think is the role of domestic colonialism, in which domestic elites replicate the core periphery figuration of the capitalist world system? And what can be done about this? And do any of you work on this? I'll go straight to you, Keston, just because you touched on that, and then open it out to anyone else.
I don't know if it's an exact mirror image, and I would resist the idea that it is an exact mirror image of those kinds of relationships. I don't think it is. There are certain patterns. So certain patterns of behaviors that elites have adopted, especially those elites that were brought in, merchants that were associated with the plantation, or merchants that were brought in to provide manufacturing for certain kinds of goods throughout Caribbean regions, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana to a lesser extent. They have repeated much of those behaviors and have used the political control through who are now Black and brown politicians to try to expropriate resources continually. But I think what has happened in the region through major riots that happened throughout the early 1930s and so on, that changed the equation a bit, but did not upend the entire system. So yeah, it's a sort of incomplete answer, but I hope it helps.
No, that's really good. I'm actually going to move on because we've got so many questions. I'm going to direct this to Genevieve because I think it's aimed at you, but it's just a broad one. Could you speak a bit more about the coercive practices on the tea plantations? For instance, how does debt bondage play a role? And how does reliance on plantation owners for basic service play a role? And specifically in India, how is caste hierarchy interwoven in these colonial labor relations? It's quite a big question, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's essentially capturing many of the key quandaries I'm trying to figure out as I write a book about this. So thank you for focusing my attention on these points. To say a little bit more about what we found with labor relations today in contemporary tea plantations, I think one thing that's really important here is to understand that across the board, obviously forced labor is illegal, right? So we're looking at a context now where forced labor is illegal, and yet we're finding businesses that are configured around profiting from forced labor. In many cases, suppliers are struggling to stay afloat and balance their own books amidst more and more price pressure from the top of the supply chain. And so we see forced labor comes about as a kind of predictable and clear outcome of certain business pressures. The mechanism, though, is not what one might expect. We found a very close link between extraordinarily low wages as a general rule and vulnerability to forced labor. So we found that wages are around 25% of the poverty line, using the numbers that workers reported to us of what they actually take home at the end of the day. And a lot of that, the reason that they're so much lower than the minimum wage is due to employers' practices of imposing various deductions on the wage. So they might charge, for instance, for electricity that's not provided. There are all these different ways in which employers try to cut corners through wage theft. And what we found is that in that context, workers are not able to buy the basic necessities of life, like food and medical care or education. And so they're often in a situation where it just takes one emergency, like somebody having a heart attack or needing more food to feed a growing family, and workers will borrow money, often from the employer, and the interest rates attached to that might be around 100%. So they face serious interest rates because of a lack of availability of loans without those rates. And so in that sense, we see this debt bondage piece that you mentioned as really important. Low wages in general creates this vulnerability to debt bondage, which was one of the key ways that we found that forced labor happens. As well, the issue you mentioned about the under provision of needs is really critical. On the tea plantations, because of the 1951 Plantations Labor Act in India, the companies are responsible for providing to workers kind of basic infrastructure, such as toilets and water, food, housing. And in most cases, that's just routinely under-provided. So workers reported, a serious lack of kind of basic sanitation, repairs with their housing not being addressed for years on end, not having access to water, even though employers are legally mandated to provide that. And so we also found that the conditions in general really shape the vulnerability to forced labor, because often, again, there's a borrowing of money to try to accumulate income to address these gaps that are left in company provisioning. And so that was another really important part of the picture. Obviously, the history of bonded labor within the tea plantations means that there are kind of very stark caste relations. So in Assam, it's an Adivasi people who are almost entirely the tea workers within Assam. In the southern region that we looked at, you see more mixed, but still quite important and clear bifurcation and across different castes. And that ties in as well to the issues around trying to solve these problems, because tea workers report that they face a huge amount of violence and hostility for leaving the plantations. And so there are quite complicated issues there, but also it's been a source of organizing for tea workers. The Adivasi Student Association and others have been really, really key in starting to get global attention to some of these issues that workers face on tea plantations. So I hope that answers at least part of the question, and I don't want to take up too much time by going on and on about it. But certainly I've got some work coming out that goes into greater depth that I'd be happy to share if you want to drop me a line.
Thanks for that, Genevieve. That was really good, and a big question to get through. So Perla, I've got a question I'm just going to direct to you, and that's kind of about how there's been a suggestion that fossil fuel companies and super polluting corporations should be compensated for their loss of profits in much the same way that slave owners were, as referenced by Keston. But what are the problems, I guess, with this approach? What do the panelists, in this case you, Perla, see as the dangers in this, given the political power accumulated by transnationals? And how can this issue be tackled in ways without the use of so-called incentives to stop these companies continuing their practices?
Thank you for the question. Well, first of all, the essential values, the essential set of values, or authentic set of values that put the economic advancements first are the main problem that we need to address. Super polluting companies are, of course, causing some incredible damage to the earth and some incredible damage to the mere fabric of society by displacing people with the effects of climate change and so many effects that we're going to be seeing in the coming years. So I think that it should be the contrary. Super polluting companies should actually pay the people that they are affecting, and should be making sure that they are not continuing these practices that are so harmful for humanity, really.
Excellent, thank you very much. Paul, I've got a question for you if you're able to do it, because you look like you might have your hands a little bit full there.
I'm good. This is Tamiri. She's just
nice to meet you, Tamiri. just eager to learn about the colonial global economy. So the question is, could aid and development cooperation north to south be considered as a colonial practice? How the rationales of the global south could be assessed to confront local and global inequality? I think how it can.
Yeah, for sure. Sometimes, because I don't know. There's definitely been something of a return to distributing aid through private sector contractors, distributing aid in the form of guarantees and kind of de-risking for private investors. Daniela Gabor's written a lot about this to kind of try and stimulate private investment to supposedly close a funding gap from traditional donors. And one of the effects of that is definitely that you see again a return of a sort of tied aid in a way, right? Because a lot of the contractors who received aid are northern-based development contractors or professional services firms. And there's also Patricia Noxola has written, a geographer at Birmingham, has written about this kind of re-colonial tied aid type relationship, even in the way that academic research on development is funded through research funding programs in the UK that very much frame development no longer as an issue of partnership, as it briefly was, but as a set of problems which Britain's world-class expertise is positioned to solve, right? Which is again another way of getting aid money to circulate within the global north and reasserting this presumed hierarchy of northern knowledge. The prospect for international development, hopefully, I think there are prospects for cooperation that are not, reducible to that kind of like re-colonial form of aid funding, but it's definitely going on. And it is all right, just very briefly, to contribute to the previous question.
Yeah, of course.
About the sort of compensation for fossil fuel extraction companies. I think it's really interesting that that's being touted, because it's this something that the extractive industries are very good at, is invoking the risk that they take and the risk that they put their capital at in order to justify arrangements that see them being burdened less with royalty rates and taxation rates. But when it comes to actually taking a hit based on the risk of putting your capital to work, extracting extractive industries that might now be stranded or no longer viable, that logic's reversed, and now you want compensation, right? And that same logic and the techniques for valuing corporations as assets based on predicted revenue streams is what's kind of used to, okay, Angel, to so I briefly lost my train of thought, is what's used to often justify maintaining this opposition to resource sovereignty and forms of resource nationalism in former colonized countries, right? Like, we are valuing this resource in this forward-looking way as potential future revenue streams. We want to de-risk those revenue streams, and you wanting to redistribute the sort of income from these resources to pay for public infrastructure, to pay for development, is precisely a form of like putting our investment at risk. And even, you know, we've seen decisions in international arbitration being more and more aggressive with what is called creeping expropriation, or what is called nationalization, to justify anything that kind of reduces future possible income revenue streams, right? But if you're going to justify your claim to a bigger piece of the pie and justify this sort of reduced taxation and royalty rates based on the fact that you're the ones putting your capital at risk, it's completely perverse to then turn around and say, no, we actually need to be compensated for finally having to actually deal with the risk that this extractive, destructive industry, you know, has to face a potential end to extraction. Sorry, I talked for slightly too long, but I briefly lost my train.
No worries. That was great. A question, I guess, a general question to anyone, because I'm not sure if anyone works on this in particular, but someone's asked whether anyone has given thought to or come across influences of global economy, perhaps even the colonial global economy in Eastern Europe, and whether there's any connection to the West, to Western Europe or North America in that context. Is that something anyone's worked on? If it is, feel free to jump in. If no one's got any thoughts, then that's also fine. Paul, you look like you're ready to say something.
No, I'm not. It's not something I work on, but I'm just trying to remember a reference that does deal with that. I can't remember it. If I do, I'll type it into the chat. That's
fine. If no one else has got any thoughts on that, I'll move on. Keston, are you ready? You're going to say something?
I didn't have a thought about that question. Unfortunately, it's not my area of expertise. But I mean, some of my more recent work has been around climate reparations and you know, building a framework to compensate countries, especially in the global South, especially in the Caribbean region, for the effects that they have faced in terms of climate change and the colonial lineages and links between climate change and you know, the present circumstances. You know, last year we experienced over 20 storms in the Atlantic hurricane season, and in the Atlantic Ocean. The Caribbean region only make up, if you count you know, bordered regions, only make up about 40 million people. So 20 storms, several of which were, you know, category 4 and 5 storms affecting the region, means that, you know, is there going to be a Caribbean? We have to really think about that in a very serious way. And, you know, the way of addressing that issue is through, in my view, a reparatory justice program that addresses these issues from a historical perspective and addresses the fact that those countries that and communities in particular that need to build capacity and resilience to address, to face the effects and exposure to climate change are the ones that have the least resources. I mean, Caribbean countries are among the most indebted in the world. They have the least fiscal capacity, but every year they're facing major storms and hurricanes, landslides, and so on. So there has to be some form of program of reparatory justice. And I'm working on some of that. I have a couple papers already on that if anyone is interested.
Excellent. Also, of course, if the speakers have any papers they want to recommend that they've written or anyone else, then feel free to put them into the chat box. I'm going to ask one more question before we do a bit of a roundup. And that's just someone's asked, what are your thoughts on Elon Musk announcing that people who cannot afford a ticket to Mars will be given loans that can be repaid by working in jobs on Mars? Not sure what sort of jobs those may be. But does anyone want to jump in on that?
There is an interesting paper, however, about white settler colonialism and the move towards colonizing space and how those two relate, you know, how settler colonialism is related to this idea that Trump put forward around a space force, and a number of these billionaires are moving towards that space force. I would find it and share it. But I mean, apart from that, I have no comment.
Anyone else got any musings on Elon Musk? No, he doesn't need any more attention. Fair enough. Actually, one more question's come in, which I think is an interesting one to think about. I'll just ask you that and then we'll wrap up. Can we consider Western scholars and journalists' reliance on local fixers and research assistants to extract knowledge from the global south as a form of global colonialism? Or is it something else? Which I guess goes back to sort of methodological practices in academia and journalism. But Perla, I'll put that to you first. And if anyone else has any thoughts on that, that'd be really good.
That's a really interesting thought. I guess if we are thinking of knowledge as a resource, then we can maybe draw a link between the practices of, you know, like publishing and the generating knowledge, where certain authors are credited and sometimes like research assistants are not. So there could be a link in there, but I mean, it's just a big, a difficult leap to take without exploring more on the topic, I guess.
I have a few thoughts on that as well. I don't know, Paul, if you wanted to go ahead, you're very welcome. I think I cut you off there.
No. I was just going to say, yes. And there is quite a lot of literature on this emerging. There was a panel addressing, so this at ECAS, the African Studies Conference at Edinburgh, a couple of years ago, and due to visa restrictions, a number of the African scholars involved couldn't actually attend. But Victor Anas and Suda Pereira are busy writing about their experience of this relation in the DRC, and I've linked to, well, I'm about to press enter in the chat to one of their papers if people want to look it up. So
I would echo all of that. I think these are really important questions, and the kind of politics of extractivism that's built into a lot of methodologies in my field around forced labor and human trafficking are kind of astonishing to me, given the topic. I think, though, we do want to differentiate there between research that may be done in collaboration with local unions and worker organizations who, for various reasons, may not want their names on it due to the sensitive nature and the potential vulnerabilities that they may have to consequences as a result of writing about certain topics. And so there are ways to have kind of transnational solidarity that's reflected and built into research as well. And so it can be quite difficult sometimes to tell, you know, what side of the line projects are on. But I do think that there's also a lot of work in my field around forced labor, increasingly, where you have scholars working in solidarity and collaboration with worker organizations, workers themselves, labor unions in global South contexts, and they're quite intentionally and reflexively trying to use different positionalities to accomplish a goal. And so even where the collaboration isn't obvious, it may also be there. But I think especially in the early research on forced labor and human trafficking, there was just almost no reflexivity around this. And colleagues of mine have argued that, you know, the research that was done really foreclosed and shut down the space for local organizations and workers themselves and migrants' rights organizations and sex workers' rights organizations who were trying to put forward a very different narrative and a very different set of solutions to these issues. So I think that that's absolutely central to keep in mind.
Thank you so much. And yeah, of course, I think this raises broader questions, doesn't it, about knowledge production and the university and what universities do, and journalists, I guess, which are probably outside the remit of our discussion today. But we are going to sort of wrap it up there. So I guess a big virtual round of applause to our excellent speakers. We can't see it, but I'm sure everyone is clapping from their houses very loudly right now. Because that was really, really good. And if you follow everyone at home, I put the socials in again, follow those. Genevieve's going to be doing a session. Paul's already got one up on the Colonial Global Economy unit that we have. So we've got more resources and there'll be more readings on those, and Keston will as well. And then we'll put these individual talks up on the YouTube channel. So make sure to subscribe there as well. And yeah, so just thank you very much for coming. And we're going to have an event to launch our policing module on policing crime and violence on the 16th of February, but I haven't finished putting that together yet. So I haven't got a link to share with you, but I'll send an email out after. But yeah, thank you very much. And we'll leave the chat open for like a few minutes so people can get the readings off anyone. And then yeah, we'll end the meeting soon, because we've had a lot of difficulty ending the meetings. It always ends really awkwardly. So trying to proactively make it not so awkward. But yeah, thank you.